beginning is a very delicate time. Know then that Denis Villeneuve's Dune is one of the most anticipated movies of the year. More than 3 decades before Denis Villeneuve's Dune, however, director David Lynch made the first cinematic incarnation of Frank Herbert's literary masterpiece. That too was highly anticipated, yet it flopped upon release. Given the strength of the source material, few thought that possible, but it happened. Why, and could it happen again? In this retrospective, I will explore David Lynch's Dune and where it went wrong. To do that, I will begin by looking into the source material and the earlier failed attempts at making a Dune movie. Then I'll shine a light on the movie itself and where it went wrong. Give my review and my recommendation for which version of it you should see today. Author Frank Herbert began work on what would become Dune in the late 1950s. When he became fascinated by the United States Department of Agriculture's attempts to use poverty grasses to halt the expansion of the Oregon dunes. He researched the issue of expanding sand dunes, and this sparked his interest in the subject of ecology. And that, in turn, made it into his new serial for the monthly analog magazine, Dune World. Dune World ran from December of 1963 to February of 1964, and the follow-up serial, The Prophet of Dune, ran from January to May of 1965. These 2 serials were then collected and extensively reworked and expanded upon, before being published as the novel Dune in August of 1965. Interestingly, the novel was rejected by every major publishing house at this time. It was published by Chilton Books, a printing house better known for publishing auto repair manuals. Dune is a great work of science fiction. There is no ancient resurfacing evil to be fought, or any clearly defined good versus a clearly defined evil. Only different schools of thought, ideologies, and competing interests between humans, or in some cases, descendants of humans. The story does not take place in our past, like with Lord of the Rings or Conan, or on some undefined other world, like Game of Thrones. Instead, the story takes place in our own distant future. Due to the opening narration of the David Lynch movie, many mistakenly believe that Dune takes place in the year 10,191 of our calendar, which is not the case. The calendar of Dune has the formation of the Spacing Guild as the starting point, not the birth of Jesus Christ. Instead of 10,000, Dune actually takes place more than 20,000 years into our future, after humanity has long since spread to the stars. But even if man has colonized the galaxy, this is no Star Trek-like utopia. These societies in this future are feudal society. The planets we see are ruled by the aristocratic families that make up the houses of the Landsraad, who are in turn ruled by the Emperor of the known universe. The most important substance in this time is the spice melange. Because this was written in the 1960s, when psychedelics and consciousness and awareness and expanding one's mind and all of that jazz was all the rage, the spice expands consciousness. Much more importantly though, it extends the natural human lifespan, and if massive quantities are consumed, one can see glimpses of the future. And this in turn is what allows the safe, faster-than-light travel through folding of space. That's Dune speak for Star Trek's warping of space. Which is what enables the Empire to be an empire. Without the spice, the different worlds of the Empire would be isolated islands in the empty vastness of space. And the aristocracy would have the same limited lifespan as the pleb. So in short, the spice must flow. The spice is only found on the desert planet of Arrakis, also known as Dune. The story kicks off with the House Atreides being given fiefdom of the planet Arrakis by the Emperor. which seems too good to be true, as the spice harvesting will make them insanely rich, more than they already are. But if something seems too good to be true, it usually is, and in this case, it is a plot. Cooked up by the Emperor and House Harkonnen, the mortal enemies of House Atreides. Their goal is to eradicate House Atreides, but unfortunately for them, they failed to take into account the resilience of Lady Jessica, the concubine of Duke Leto Atreides, or their son, Paul Atreides. Over the next 20 years, author Frank Herbert went on to write 5 more Dune novels. He passed before completing what was to be the 7th and final book of the saga. But the saga continued in the late 1990s, then written by Frank's son, Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson. Together, they filled in the blanks of the Dune universe, in part based on original manuscripts and notes from Frank Herbert himself that they claimed to have come across. Their books are still being written to this day. So far though, Hollywood has only really shown an interest in the first book, and they showed that interest very early on. In the summer of 1971, not 6 years since the original novel was published, Arthur P. Jacobs, the producer behind the original Planet of the Apes film franchise, optioned the movie rights to Dune. One of the most prolific filmmakers of the time was David Lean, the director behind epic classics like The Bridge on the River Kwai, Lawrence of Arabia, and Dr. Zhivago. And this is who Jacobs hired to direct the very first incarnation of Dune. Development had begun, but came to a screeching halt when Jacobs himself died in 1973. In 1974, the rights reverted back to Frank Herbert, but not for long. They were soon picked up again, on behalf of director Alejandro Jodorowsky. Jodorowsky's Dune is the stuff of legend, as well as its own feature-length documentary. It is, without a shred of doubt, the greatest movie never made. After seeing more and more success with his earlier movies, the surrealist explorations Fondo y Lis, El Topo, and The Holy Mountain, Jodorowsky decided that with his next movie, he was going to change the world. He was going to make a movie that would expand consciousness and forever change everyone watching it. He was, in his words, on a mission from God. To help him, he enlisted the help of what he called spiritual warriors, such as Moebius, to storyboard the entire movie like a comic, as well as design the characters and outfits, with additional set and ship designs by H.R. Giger and Chris Foss. These special effects would be provided by Dan O'Bannon, and the cast included the likes of Salvador Dali, Mick Jagger, David Carradine, and even Orson Welles. Everything seemed incredible, but it was still set to be directed by surrealist director Alejandro Jodorowsky, and this turned out to be an insurmountable obstacle in landing a funding and distribution agreement with one of the major studios. And without that, the movie could not be made. From the Hollywood point of view, there was nothing in Jodorowsky's surrealist catalogue which remotely suggested that he would be capable of directing something in the sheer scale and scope of Moebius storyboards. Worse yet, Jodorowsky made it abundantly clear that his vision could not be tampered with in any way, shape, or form, so no notes would be accepted. As for running time, it would be however long Jodorowsky decided it needed to be. If a studio offered 2 hours, he might counter 12 hours. No Hollywood studio was going to go along with the package Jodorowsky was offering, and lo and behold, no one did. Jodorowsky's Dune wasn't picked up for distribution, and therefore it never got the funding needed to make it, or even to keep the ball rolling. The project imploded in 1976, and Dino De Laurentiis swooped in and picked up the movie rights from the money-bereft rubble that remained. But from the ashes of Jodorowsky's Dune, other greatness rose. The spiritual warriors Dan O'Bannon and H.R. Giger would go on to make Alien, and Jodorowsky himself would partner up with Moebius again to repurpose their ideas in comics and kickstart the Jodo-verse. Moebius storyboards, which every studio had been supplied copies of, would serve as visual inspiration in movies for decades to come. Jodorowsky's Dune is incidentally a fantastic documentary, and checking it out would be well worth your time. Dino De Laurentiis intended to make a franchise out of Dune and to market it as Star Wars for adults. To direct the first movie, he hired Ridley Scott. Scott worked on the script for a few months, and at one point, he wanted to split the story into 2 movies, although that never came to pass. New Line Cinema founder Bob Shaye's decision to split Lord of the Rings into not just 2, but 3 movies wouldn't happen for almost another 2 decades. So Hollywood was not yet ready for that at this time. Dune was 1 book, and the studio expected 1 movie. Scott ultimately ended up leaving the project for personal reasons. His elder brother Frank unexpectedly died around this time, and Dune was such a big project it would take up years of his time. Those were years he, at that moment in time, did not have the heart to commit to, so he gave the studio what he had done up till that point and walked out. Raffaella De Laurentiis then started looking for another director, and since this was an age where the studios weren't afraid of taking risks, she was looking for another upcoming auteur director with a unique and distinct expression. In late 1980, she found one in David Lynch. David Lynch had previously directed Eraserhead, before seeing commercial success with The Elephant Man, the movie which put him on Raffaella De Laurentiis' radar to begin with. In the aftermath of that success, he was offered bigger movies, such as Return of the Jedi, but he chose to go with Dune. Under Lynch, development more or less started over from scratch. Over the next 2 years, Lynch oversaw and wrote multiple iterations of the script, and assembled his cast and production team. For the cast, Lynch went with a mix of newcomers, like Kyle MacLachlan, seasoned professionals like Max von Sydow, and highly skilled talent that had yet to conquer the mainstream, like Patrick Stewart, and lest we forget, Sting as Fade Routha. In my opinion, the cast is all around terrific, one standout being Brad Dourif. He attended a watch party of Dune hosted by the crew behind the upcoming 80s sci-fi documentary In Search of Tomorrow, where he revealed that he was the one who wrote Piter's Litany alongside David Lynch to mirror Paul Atreides' Litany of Fear.
It is by will alone I set my mind in motion. It is by the juice of Safu that thoughts acquire speed, the lips acquire stains, the stains become a warning. It is by will alone I set my mind in motion.
With the team assembled, filming begun in March of 1983. For production company the De Laurentiis Group, Dune was a major project and one they had the most ambition for, hoping to get 3 movies out of it, and to this end, key cast members were contracted for 3 movies. They wanted to cut cost where they could though, so production on Dune was planned to correspond with the production of another De Laurentiis feature, Conan the Destroyer. Both movies were filmed at the same facilities in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And by having both film at the same time, cost could be cut by recycling the on-set crew between both movies, as well as by paying for catering and accommodation for 1 production cycle instead of 2. The dollar went far in Mexico. The location offered huge sound stages. as well as proximity to the Samala Yucca dune fields, where many of the exterior shots were filmed. Some local products even made it into the movie. Most famously, the guild uniforms were made from repurposed body bags, and not factory fresh ones either. The fact that they had been previously used was kept from the cast. Production proceeded without any major incidents, apart from that one day when local authorities shut filming down due to a ruckus involving the cast of Conan. See our corresponding Conan the Destroyer retrospective for more details on that. But that was a minor thing in the bigger scheme of things. The real issues didn't begin until the movie was in post-production. The single biggest issue facing Dune was in locking down the final cut of the movie. David Lynch had filmed about 4 hours worth of footage, and from this, he intended to cut a movie in the 3-hour range. That is what his script and his vision called for. However, Universal, the distributor who was reimbursing a big chunk of production company the De Laurentiis Group's outlay on the movie, demanded the release version have a running time of little more than 2 hours. Rather than challenge Universal on this, Dino De Laurentiis forwarded the mandate to director David Lynch and made it clear this was how it was going to be. In Dino's defense, he gave his filmmakers significant freedom to do what they wanted on set, and Lynch got away with things that would have gotten any director fired many times over if they tried anything like it today. For instance, at the time when the movie was being filmed, a mysterious and incurable new illness that produced lesions wrought havoc upon gay communities. So Lynch gave a variation of it to Baron Harkonnen. Dino De Laurentiis had no objection to that, or to any other of the weird and disgusting Harkonnen moments that Lynch wanted to put in the movie. But when Universal demanded a 2-hour runtime, Dino De Laurentiis would not listen to any of Lynch's objections that it could not be done. It had to be done, and if Lynch could not do it, it would be done for him. In the end, Lynch was there and oversaw proceedings, and tried to salvage as much as he could, while Dino and Raffaella De Laurentiis proceeded to slash down the running time of the evolving cut. I say evolving cut, because Lynch never got to make a director's cut he was pleased with. The project went straight from 4-hour assembly cut of all filmed footage to the eventual 2-hour theatrical cut. As they soon found out, however, telling the story of the first book in a 2-hour feature film while retaining a cohesive narrative simply wasn't possible. Not only is the screen story itself too big to be compressed into that running time, there were so many new concepts and different factions audiences had to be introduced to. To help clarify matters, a new introduction with Virginia Madsen was filmed, where she tells audiences the story. When she said,
"A beginning is a very delicate time,"
she was probably perfectly expressing the frustration of the producers. In theaters, audiences were even given a pamphlet explaining the backstory and the different factions. It did not help. For audiences that were familiar with the novel, the movie in some sense felt like a clip show with the best bits and pieces from it. But audiences that weren't familiar with the novel at all were hopelessly lost. Dune wasn't received particularly well, either by the audience or by professional critics.
Now this is kind of amazing. Out of a couple hundred films that Roger and I each saw this year, we agree that the biggest disappointment of the year is Dune, with a huge budget, a talented young director, and a script based on a highly regarded science fiction novel. I think it's impossible for anyone who hasn't read the Dune books to follow what's going on in this story, which is needlessly complicated, and then there is a whole layer of ugliness.
One of the sad things about this picture is that it doesn't give you any entertainment, even on the level of looking at the special effects and the wonderful things happening on the screen.
They're quite cheap.
In addition to the confusing narrative, the movie was much maligned for having poor special effects, which I think is a little bit unwarranted. Both the set design and the sets themselves were spectacular. The still suits by Bob Ringwood were so good that not only did they form the starting point for the bat suit later worn by Michael Keaton, Denis Villeneuve looked to them for his version of Dune. The sandworms genuinely look massive, and even the manner in which cinematographer Freddie Francis made the Arrakeen sky orange is flawless. The spice-induced blue within blue ice effect, on the other hand, well, it was the best that could be done at the time. Outside of contacts, that wouldn't do quite the same thing. They certainly spared little expense on those effects, as each frame had to be rotoscoped, but questioning whether or not that was the right decision is certainly justified. What was unquestionably bad even for the time, though, is any sequence featuring spaceships in space. These shots were a good decade and a half behind audience expectations even at the time of release, and that stuck out like a sore thumb. I think the dissatisfaction with these shots, and a distinct lack of some establishing shots showing more of the alien worlds, was greatly exacerbated by the narrative being confusing, which in turn left the movie as a whole being stuck with the label of having poor special effects. Dune grossed around $30 million domestically, against a budget of more than 40. In other words, Dune flopped. Not as bad as you might have been led to believe, but bad enough that any and all sequel plans were scrapped. To David Lynch, this was a bitter pill to swallow. The financial failure hurt, but he has since said in interviews that he would have gotten over that if Dune had been the movie he wanted to make. But because of the running time restrictions, it wasn't. And that is why Dune remains an open wound for him to this day. But even if he had gotten to make the movie he wanted, there was one thing David Lynch plainly got wrong. One thing which even Frank Herbert wasn't too pleased with, despite being involved with and endorsing the movie. A central part of Dune is the prophecies revolving around the coming of a foretold Messiah, the liberator of the people of the desert planet Arrakis. That is why the Fremen, the people of Arrakis, are so responsive to Paul Atreides. They think he is their Messiah. Their belief is vindicated in the end, when he not only liberates them, he makes it rain on a desert planet. How can this be? Well, according to David Lynch's movie, Paul Atreides really is the Messiah. By contrast, Frank Herbert's intention in the books was to convey that.
He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy! Now go away!
Paul Atreides is a leader who inspired a cult-like following, and Frank Herbert uses his Dune saga to warn about such leaders. So the movie kind of missed the point there. Even the Fremen's firmly held beliefs, the prophecies that told of the coming of their Messiah, were deliberately planted there by the Bene Gesserit, and they planted them on many planets across the universe, just in case they would come in handy one day. On Arrakis, they did. Also, given Lynch's ending of the movie, adapting the sequel books would have posed a challenge if the planned sequels had ever happened, which they didn't, so that's something of a moot point, isn't it? In my opinion, Dune is a movie that has a lot of unfulfilled potential. I'm a big fan of the set design and the cast. The score by Brian Eno and Toto is great. But the movie is betrayed by its own running time, as a story like Dune simply cannot be done justice in 2 hours. The narrative needed key sequences that were either left on the cutting room floor, or in some cases, never filmed. The movie, in my opinion, looks gorgeous. And if you already know the story from the books, there is a lot to enjoy here. But because of the running time imposed narrative restrictions, the theatrical cut of Dune is something I'd be hard-pressed to recommend to anyone not familiar with the novels. That is a testament to how badly the producers let the movie down in order to hit that specified running time. The frustrating thing about it is how easily avoidable this all could have been. They either had to convince Universal to allow a 3-hour movie in theaters, or they would have to divide the story over 2 movies, whether they were filmed back to back, or if they just filmed the first half of the book and hoped it would be successful enough to warrant the second half be filmed in a later sequel. Whatever they chose to do, the decision needed to be made long before cameras rolled, and everyone needed to be on board with it. That didn't happen. So instead, we ended up with a movie that tried to bite over more than its approved running time allowed it to chew. But that's the theatrical cut. As you may be aware, there is an extended version too. What about it? In addition to the theatrical cut, there is another official cut of the movie, namely the extended cut. It is about 3 hours long, which is how long David Lynch wanted Dune to be, but this should in no way, shape or form be confused for a director's cut. Lynch never made a director's cut of Dune, and he had nothing to do with this extended cut, quite the contrary. The extended cut was assembled by the producers for the TV market of the 80s.
Now, for the first time ever, Dune, featuring 50 minutes of never-before-seen footage.
The running time was padded so the movie could be split in two and then broadcast over 2 nights. They increased the movie's running time by adding scenes that had been cut from theaters back into the movie, but not necessarily the scenes that Lynch would have wanted or where he would have wanted them. As I said before, making the ice blue was expensive at the time, and the producers weren't taking on that cost. So the Fremen inserts are painfully obvious, as the actors have their natural eyes in them. From the theatrical reception, the producers also knew that many audiences found the movie difficult to comprehend, so in an attempt to address this, they cut Virginia Madsen's opening monologue and replaced it with a newly created animated prologue sequence. If indeed you can call it animated. In reality, a narrator was going over the abbreviated history of the Dune universe over a slideshow of concept art. To say David Lynch did not approve is something of an understatement. He refused credit for the extended cut, so the credited director on it is Alan Smithee, the marquee name used whenever a director refuses blame for the final product after the studio has interfered just that little bit too much with it. In a final insult, the writer of this version is credited as Judas Booth, named after Judas Iscariot and John Wilkes Booth, the actor who famously shot Abraham Lincoln. Those are the only 2 official versions of Dune available, the theatrical and extended cut, both of which are producer cuts, and neither of them reflects Lynch's vision. Universal have made attempts to have Lynch come back to oversee the creation of a director's cut, but he will have none of it. So unless the studio decides to get creative on their own accord, those are the 2 official versions we are stuck with. So, of the 2 official versions, which one is better? Which one would I recommend? The answer is quite simply neither. Because if we leave the realm of official versions behind for the moment, other and by far superior options suddenly find themselves on the table. There is a corner on the internet devoted to fan edits of released movies. Many of these are something of a mixed bag, but others are able to recut movies in a way which brings out the director's intent in a better way than the official version ever did. The most famous example here is Brian De Palma's Raising Cain. Fan editor Pete Gelderblom recut the movie in a way which impressed Brian De Palma himself, so much that he arranged for Gelderblom's fan edit to be released officially as the director's cut of Raising Cain. With what fan edits are and how good they can be established, let's get back to Dune. Between the extended cut and other deleted scenes released as bonus features on various releases around the world over the years, nearly every scene David Lynch ever filmed for Dune is out there in the ether, so skilled fan editors have much material with which to work. They've taken advantage of that, as there are numerous Dune fan edits, and most of them are superior to both official versions. However, one Dune fan edit stands above all others, let alone the two official versions. In my opinion, the definitive version of David Lynch's Dune, the one you can see and get even without having read the books, is the fan edit Alternative Edition Redux by Spice Diver. This version has a running time of 3 hours, and among many improvements, it restructures the narrative into 4 books. It incorporates bits and pieces from the animated prologue here and there, and it recolors the eyes of the Fremen where the blue was missing. In my opinion, Universal really should do with this fan edit what they did with Raising Kain, and release it officially. But until that happens, where can you see it? Before we move on, one thing has to be made abundantly clear. Neither Midnight's Edge nor any of its affiliates, sponsors, or partners approves of piracy in any way, shape, or form. You should not download anything illegally on the internet, so before you even think about procuring any fan edits, make sure you own a legally bought copy of the movie first. Only when you have paid the distributor for their official product can you consider looking for a fan edit. With that warning out of the way, the best way to get Spice Diver's Dune Alternative Edition Redux is to head on over to fanedit.org and read up on the subject there. Or you can torrent it. This particular fan edit is sufficiently sought after that it can be found on the high seas as well. If you go there, which we don't recommend, but if you do, you need to protect yourself from all the malware and surveillance that is rampant wherever torrents are found. And the best way to do that is by using a VPN, such as the one provided by this channel's sponsor, Surfshark. A VPN, or Virtual Private Network, is a privacy protection tool which guarantees instant online safety. Surfshark encrypts all data sent via the internet, so that no one can obtain usernames, logins, private messages, or steal content or other sensitive data. On top of that, Surfshark allows you to change the country you access the internet from, which in turn allows you to bypass geo-blocking restrictions. One of the advantages with Surfshark over many other VPN providers is that it allows one account to be used on unlimited devices. So if you get Surfshark VPN, you can use it on your stationary computer, your smartphone, and any other device you might have. Since Surfshark sponsors this channel, we have a special deal for you. If you go to the link in the description and type in the code MIDNIGHT when ordering, that triggers an exclusive offer in which you get 83% off the normal list price, plus 3 extra months for free. Surfshark also offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in trying it out. Do check out the link in the description below for further details. In the year 2000, Sci-Fi Channel released the 3-part miniseries Frank Herbert's Dune, developed by John Harrison. The director's edition of that had a running time of 5 hours, so it does not have the narrative issues that the Lynch movie did. But it also did not have the same resources to put into cast, designs, and the sets, so the two are quite different. It was followed by a second miniseries, Children of Dune, which adapted the second and third novels. A third miniseries was planned, but due to a change in priorities at Sci-Fi, that plan never came to fruition. There have been attempts made to reboot Dune on the big screen for the past decade, and we may document both these miniseries and those failed movie attempts in later videos. The one that made it all the way though was Denis Villeneuve's Dune, and it takes some level of inspiration from the David Lynch movie, showing how influential it in the end was. What the Villeneuve movie won't have is the running time restrictions which ultimately killed David Lynch's Dune. Like Ridley Scott wanted for his defunct version, Villeneuve's Dune will actually be split into 2 movies. It would appear Hollywood has learned some lessons over the course of the last decades. If you liked this video, we have similar ones for both Conan movies, and another one for Keanu Reeves' Constantine is imminent. For more ultimate retrospectives, as well as daily content like editorials and mini-documentaries, be sure to hit subscribe and indicate you want notifications on all videos. Also, to get 83% off the normal list price, plus 3 extra months for free of Surfshark VPN, go to the link in the description and type in the code MIDNIGHT. And now, let me know your thoughts on David Lynch's Dune and which version you prefer in the comments.